Today on Europe Now, I'm in discussion with His Excellency Gabriele Visentin, the new EU ambassador to Australia. Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us on Europe Now.
Thank you for having me.
Ambassador, your tenure is at a very interesting time here. Your predecessor, Michael Pulsch, of course, saw many of his years during the time of COVID and lockdowns. Thankfully, you're beginning in what is now hopefully a post-pandemic era of openings and fresh beginnings. I wonder what new challenges and opportunities you see for EU-Australia relations in 2023.
Again, thanks for having me. And I would like to start by acknowledging the fact that the bilateral EU-Australia relationship is at probably the best ever moment in the last years. This comes from a shift in terms of national policies, which has happened in the past 6 months, be it on climate change or be it on attitudes toward free trade agreements. And I really see that there is a very, very big amount of opportunities for enhancing our relationship. I think we are at a very, very good juncture here. As you said, we are in a post-COVID, and if not post-COVID, at least in a period, in a time where we can live with COVID, we can coexist with COVID without limiting our liberties as we were forced to do in the past years. So, yes, I think that in 2023 we will surely see some very good advances in current files, in new files, and we will definitely deepen our already excellent cooperation. But if you allow me, I would like maybe to talk a little bit about the past, not only about the future. Australia and the EU are allies, are partners, are friends. And our relationship is based not only on economic interest, but also on shared values. And this is particularly strengthened by the fact that in 2022 is the 60th year of the EU-Australia diplomatic relationship. And just think where we were 60 years ago. Australia was around 7 million inhabitant country. Now it's 25.5. Mm-hmm. The economy has incredibly grown. The EU only had 6 member states. Now it's 27, 450 million inhabitants. First World Economic and Trade Bloc. Again, incredible development in terms of wealth. But also, 60 years ago, Aboriginals were not even considered citizens here. In Europe, we had countries which were fascist dictatorships, as well as others were under Soviet, ruling, indirect ruling, but also human rights. Many of member states, even democratic member states, criminalized homosexuality. So let's see. We can really see ourselves as friends and as people who share the same values. It's not just a matter of interest, it's also a matter of values. And this is the precise added value in dealing with each other. Because, as you know, normally relations among countries are based on interests or values or both. And in our case, it's both. And it's not so common. It's really important to highlight this, because this means that it's not just a matter of having easy relations between the two of us, but it's also the fact that we are aligned on the world stage in terms of Western liberal democracies who believe not just in economic growth, but also in liberties, in civil liberties, in freedom, in human rights. And this aligns us very much in the international sphere. and I will probably anticipate one of your questions, this is also, there is a clear evidence of this, also in the fact that we both are fighting for Ukraine. It's not just, how can I say, help a country against a mighty, powerful neighbor who invades it. It's also a matter of alignment on how we see our international rules-based order based on the UN Charter, not based on the law of the jungle, but based on the fact that we live together according to principles which connect us. And of course, we as EU are very, very thankful to Australia for the, I could say, huge support that Australia has been giving to Ukraine, both militarily, financially, diplomatically, siding with the EU and with the US on the sanctions packages. So this is something which is not free of charge for Australia, and we totally acknowledge this, and we are extremely thankful, because helping Ukraine means helping the EU. Yeah. And again, looking at the past, this comes in a long story. I mean, Australians sent their boys, their sons, to Europe in World War I and World War II. So it's not the first time that Australia, how can I say, is directly involved in European affairs. And we are really thankful for what happened in the past and for what is happening now.
Well, we'll come to those shared values and the list of opportunities and challenges that you've sketched out there. I wonder, though, if I could ask you this. We've heard a lot about, next generation EU, particularly in terms of the various instruments and tools that the EU has developed to try to cope economically and to reconstruct its economies in the aftermath of the pandemic. Yeah. How have you seen those tools and those implements? Because the EU's poured trillions of euros into this. I mean, some of it, I think, has been very audacious and imaginative, but some of it's been bumpy, hasn't it? Because of, disruptions to global supply chains and so on and so forth. What's your sense of the sort of post-COVID European economies at the moment?
One step back. What happened with Next Generation is a watershed event in the history of the European integration. It's the first time ever where the EU member states have agreed to issue common debt. Because Next Generation Europe is financed through loans which are financed by the EU budget. This means that it is a mutualized debt for all member states. And this never happened before. So this is the first time in Europe where all member states have agreed to share common debt in real terms. And this is producing results. If you look at the economic indicators, even with a war at our borders, even with the huge energy prices, the European economies are back on track at the pre-COVID level. The only exception being the EU, which is not the UK, which is not EU, but all the EU's economies are back on track. So all the measures, the trillions which have been put forward, have really been useful and have provided a solid ground to relaunch the EU's economies, definitely. And a big part in that is the greening the EU economy. So what is happening now is that we are really going green, which is good, obviously, for the environment, but it's also geopolitically very important in order to reduce any kind of dependency from Russia in terms of energy provision, like gas or oil, but also in terms of minerals and raw materials. Going green, developing our economy towards a green economy is good for the environment, but allows us as well to get out of the dependency from Russia sooner than foreseen.
Can I ask you now about Digital Europe? to switch from the COVID crisis
Yes.
into the digital crisis, as it were, that...
Is there any?
Well, from one angle, if you think about it, I guess there's the sense that more and more people started to turn to digitalisation in a way that had never been possible before. Remote working, people trying things out and trying things on in terms of lifestyle opportunities through digital technologies. And of course, in this area, through digital Europe, the EU's been a world leader.
Yes.
Whether we think of general data protection regulations, which now are not just European, it's been a sort of global model. But more and more attention, it seems at the moment, is being paid to cyber threats. And I wondered what your assessment is of how risky these cyber threats are at the current juncture, and how Digital Europe and the Digital Europe program can be used or marshalled to confront these threats.
Well, the EU is at the forefront in terms of legislation to fight cyber threats and to protect the citizens in a digitalized world. We have very stringent legislation on database, we have very stringent legislation on protection of data and protection of persons. So, and we have also launched, we can call it a legislation, on the big data provider, so that there is a sort of a code of self-control in order to fight hate talks or this kind of very negative impact that the digital world might have. Cyber threats are clearly a very high concern for us. We have experienced cyber attacks on some member states and on some institutions coming normally from Russia. We have a certain sensitivity, and we have even established a center to counter cyber threats in Helsinki, which works hand in hand with NATO. So let's say that we gave ourselves the capacity to counter that. Also, just say basically bearing in mind the military know-how or capabilities, which are not embedded in the EU itself, but which do cooperate with the EU. So it's really something that could be also of maybe of inspiration here in Australia, when you also have issues in terms of cyber threats coming indeed from another bigger neighbor.
Yeah. Climate change has been top of the political agenda in Europe for quite some time, and now in the aftermath of COP27, there's been, I suppose, a sense of disappointment by some that it's not been sufficient to be able to cope with the nature of these global challenges. The EC president has commented that the EU remains on track to be climate neutral by 2050. Yeah. Where is the EU at the current moment on climate change?
We are respecting the goals. We gave ourselves also intermediate goals by 2030, so we are advancing on that. We are very well on track. And we are really going to climate neutral by 2050. We are pretty sure on that. Of course, in order to facilitate or to ensure that this will happen smoothly, we have to ensure that we have the supply chains for us to go green. Yes. are not only exist but are guaranteed for the next 10 to 20 years, and for this we need certain kinds of raw materials, of minerals, rare earths, which are needed, for example, to build electric batteries or to build solar panels, and normally these minerals come from China or Russia. And this is why we would very much welcome an agreement with our Australian friends on access to the minerals and the rare earths that Australia has in huge volumes. And this would really help us to go green and to achieve the zero emission, which is definitely possible, but it would be made easier had we access to Australian minerals. But this is something which is happening, and it's not just a top-down approach. It's also a bottom-up request from the citizens, because if you look at the latest at the results of the latest elections in Europe, even starting 3 years ago with the election of the European Parliament and going down now to the national elections in Germany, in France and in other countries, you see that the Green Party has had huge success amongst the young generations, because the Greens are not seen anymore as a one-theme party, but they are seen as an environmentally conscious party.
You mentioned China. There's a global political debate on China.
Yeah.
From the standpoint of shared values, democratic, liberal societies, I suppose there's every reason, arguably, to be tougher on China. The EU has previously dubbed China as a strategic rival, but of course recognises that China is absolutely vital as a market for Europe. Australia shares this complex problem on China. How is the EU navigating that conundrum?
Well, we maintain that our relations with China have to be interpreted with a prism. Yes, a systemic rival, as you said, but also an economic competitor, but a global partner. So we say that China is a partner on issues which can be addressed globally, climate change, is a competitor economically because we compete on the world markets. Of course, there are rules as well on the international market. So we cooperate very well with China in economic terms, as long as China respects the international rules of all the trade. So copyrights, for example, or other issues as that. And then, of course, we are a systemic rival when it comes to the respect of democracy, human rights, or where there are things which are really not compatible with our way of doing. But if you allow me, I have witnessed a kind of narrative from the Australian authorities in the last month or so, which aligns very much Australia with the EU, a pragmatic way to approach China, namely protect our interests, but dealing whenever necessary. I mean, I have seen with a lot of interest the latest press releases after Prime Minister Albanese met President Xi, or after Foreign Minister Wong engaged with her interlocutors as well in the Pacific. I think that we both are sharing this way of dealing with China in a pragmatic, adult way, not ideological. And I think this is the only way we can deal with China. China will remain very likely, of course, it will remain as the first trading partner, both for you and for us. The issue here is to allow ourselves not to be dependent on China. I mean, nowadays, we have to be very careful on the choice of the partners with whom we trade in the long run and on which we base our strategic dependencies. And that's the point. That's exactly the point. It's not reducing our good relations with China whenever we can, but it is having a smart, pragmatic way of looking at our dependencies, strategic dependencies, and reducing them as much as possible. I mean, it's much better to be dependent amongst friends rather than being dependent with people with whom we just share economic interests. And that takes me back to your first question. So you have countries with whom you have interest, and you have countries with whom you have interest and values. And it's probably better to have to deal more with the second category.
Finally, Ambassador, I'd like to ask you just a couple of questions about the work that you do here at the delegation with your team. What are your first impressions of Australia and settling into the position?
Well, it's a fantastic country. I love it. It's really nice. It's so diverse, and diversity means strength. And I really see that here there is a real melting pot, but in the good sense of the word. I mean, there is equal opportunities. There are various origins which melt down. The access to professions. You see, you walk in the street. You go in the boards of directors whom I met, I meet high-level officials, and you see a difference of faces, of colors, which makes Australia strong. And it's really nice, it's vibrant, it's refreshing. Of course, in Sydney and in Melbourne it's more evident than in Canberra, but that's still, it's still remarkable in Canberra as well. No, it's really nice, and well, one of your most iconic architectural, let's say, buildings is the harbour, the bridge on the Sydney Bay, and I think it's really nice to have a bridge as one of your major architectural features, because bridge is positive, bridge is linking people, bridge is a positive architecture, whereas you have others which can be negative. Walls are a negative architecture, whereas a bridge is a positive. So. It's you have beautiful bridges all over, but I always like to think when I went to...
You like the Sydney Harbour Bridge?
Yeah, because it's, to me, if you want, it symbolises the spirit of Australia.
Yeah. And of course, Europe has been so central to that diversity in Australia that you are talking about. To finish by jumping ahead, as it were, perhaps to the end of your ambassadorship. So with your crystal ball, looking through your crystal ball, if I could phrase it like this, what would you like to see? What do you think is possible in terms of the continued maturing of the relationship between Australia and the EU?
Well, I would like to have all the fronts which now we have open closed, so the FTA, maybe associating Australia to the research and development programs of the EU, which is called Horizon Europe. And to me, it would be perfect match between strengthening our trade relationship together with strengthening our scientific cooperation, because that would mean that our researchers work together to develop new technologies or new products which can then be put on the market. So it would go very much in line. And by the way, Horizon Europe is the biggest public financed research program of the world. Is 150 billion Australian dollars. So associating Australia to that would allow Australian researchers and universities and companies to be treated as if they were coming from a member state of the EU. So it means full access. So I would like to have a 360 degrees relation enhanced. So trade, science, defense, because it's really important that we acknowledge the fact that there is a big possibilities for strengthening as well the cooperation on defense.
Ambassador Visentin, thank you very much for joining us on Europe Now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you.